The crack of gunfire split the morning air as Grace Jameson ducked behind an overturned wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs. Arizona Territory, 1885, was no place for a 35-year-old schoolteacher from Boston, but here she was stranded in the middle of nowhere with outlaws bearing down on the stagecoach that had been carrying her to Tucson. "Stay down, madam," a deep voice commanded as a tall figure leapt from his horse, landing beside her in a cloud of dust. Grace clutched her traveling bag to her chest, eyes wide as she stared at the stranger. He couldn't have been more than 25, his face partially hidden beneath the brim of a worn Stetson, but what she could see was all sharp angles and determination. His revolver barked twice, sending one of the bandits tumbling from his saddle. "Thomas O'Malley, at your service," he said without taking his eyes off the retreating outlaws. "Though most folks just call me Tucker." I'm Grace Jameson," she managed, wincing as another bullet splintered wood just inches from her head. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Jameson," Tucker replied with the ghost of a smile. "Though I reckon the circumstances could be better." The stagecoach driver and the other passengers were nowhere to be seen. Either they'd fled into the scrubby desert landscape or Grace swallowed hard they hadn't survived the initial attack. Tucker fired again, his movements smooth and practiced. "Last one's running. You hurt anywhere, Miss Jameson?" Grace did a quick mental inventory. "No, I don't believe so." "Just shaken." He nodded, holstering his weapon before offering her a hand. His fingers were calloused but gentle as he helped her to her feet. The sun caught his features fully now, revealing eyes the color of a summer storm and a jawline that could have been carved from desert stone. "What's a lady like you doing out here alone?" he asked, retrieving his horse's reins. Grace straightened her skirts, trying to recover some dignity. "I've accepted a position as the schoolteacher in Tucson." Tucker's eyebrows rose slightly. "Long way from home, I'd wager." "Boston," she confirmed. "And yes, it's quite the change of scenery." He chuckled, the sound warm and unexpectedly pleasant. "That's putting it mildly." His expression grew serious as he surveyed the wreckage of the stagecoach. "Driver's dead, so's the shotgun rider." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth. "And the other passengers? Looks like they took what they could carry and headed south." Tucker frowned. "Not the smartest move, towns east of here." "How far?" "Rattlesnake Springs, about 15 miles. He glanced at the sky. "Sun's high. We won't make it before dark if we don't get moving." "We," Grace echoed. Tucker shrugged. "Can't very well leave you out here, can I? Wouldn't be gentlemanly." Before she could respond, he was lifting her onto his horse, her skirts bunching awkwardly around her knees. Grace hadn't ridden astride since she was a girl, and certainly never in the company of a handsome stranger. "I can walk," she protested. Tucker swung up behind her, his chest warm against her back. 15 miles in those shoes? I don't think so, Miss Jameson." The horse, a beautiful dappled gray, snorted as if in agreement. "Hold on," Tucker advised, reaching around her to take the reins. Grace didn't know what unnerved her more, the lingering threat of outlaws, the desolate landscape stretching in every direction, or the firm presence of Tucker O'Malley behind her. His nearness was both reassuring and disconcerting, especially when the horse's gait brought them into momentary contact. "Have you been in Arizona Territory long, Mr. O'Malley?" she asked, desperate for conversation to distract from their unusual proximity. 10 years this September," he replied. "Came out from Kentucky when I was 15. Worked cattle, tried my hand at prospecting. Now I scout for the cavalry sometimes, run supplies when they need it." 15. Grace couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "That's awfully young to set out on your own." She felt rather than saw his shrug. "Wasn't much to keep me back east. Pa died in the war, Ma remarried a man who didn't take to having another man's son around. Figured the frontier was as good a place as any to make my own way. The simple telling of his story made Grace's heart ache. While she had been attending finishing school and dreaming of becoming a teacher, this boy had been carving a life from the unforgiving desert. "And what brings a Boston schoolteacher all the way to Tucson?" he asked, changing the subject. Grace hesitated. The true answer was complicated, tied up in scandal and heartbreak and the desperate need to start over somewhere anywhere else. "I wanted an adventure," she said finally. "It wasn't entirely a lie," Tucker laughed. "Well, you're certainly getting one." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the landscape gradually shifting from open desert to rocky outcroppings dotted with cacti and scrub brush. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Grace was grateful for her bonnet, though her throat grew parched and her dress stuck to her back with sweat. As if reading her mind, Tucker produced a canteen. "Small sips," he advised. "Water's precious out here." Grace took a careful drink, the warm liquid a blessed relief to her dry throat. "Thank you," she said, passing it back. Their fingers brushed, and she felt an unexpected flutter in her stomach. "There's a creek about 2 miles ahead," Tucker said. "We can rest the horse and refill there." True to his word, they soon reached a small stream cutting through the rocks. Tucker dismounted first, then reached up to help Grace down. His hand spanned her waist easily, and for a breathless moment, she found herself looking directly into his eyes as he lowered her to the ground. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping back quickly. Tucker busied himself with the horse, leading it to drink while Grace stretched her legs, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. She hadn't ridden in years and certainly not for such a distance. "Not used to being in the saddle?" Tucker asked, noticing her discomfort. Grace smiled ruefully. "Is it that obvious? Most Eastern ladies aren't." He filled the canteen and splashed water on his face. With his hat off and his dark hair damp, he looked even younger. Grace found herself studying him, the lean strength in his shoulders, the way his shirt stretched across his back as he moved. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, nothing like the polished gentleman of Boston society, but there was something compelling about him. She looked away quickly when he turned, not wanting to be caught staring. "How much farther to Rattlesnake Springs?" she asked. "Another few hours." "We'll make it before sundown." He glanced at her travel-worn appearance. "Town's not much general store, saloon, livery, but there's a widow named Mrs. Henderson who takes in boarders. She'll have a room and a hot bath for you." The mention of a bath made Grace sigh with longing. "That sounds heavenly." Tucker grinned, and the expression transformed his face, erasing the hard edges and bringing a boyish charm to his features. "Reckon it would, after a day like today." They rested for nearly half an hour before continuing their journey. This time, when Tucker lifted her onto the horse, Grace was more prepared for the intimacy of their shared saddle. Still, she couldn't help but be aware of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the occasional murmured commands to his horse, the way one arm sometimes brushed her waist when the terrain grew uneven. "Have you always wanted to be a teacher?" he asked as they navigated a rocky slope. Grace smiled, thinking of her childhood dreams. "Since I was a little girl. My father was a professor at Harvard. He believed education was the greatest gift one could give." "Smart man," Tucker commented. "Never had much schooling myself, but I can read and cipher well enough." "That's more than many can say," Grace replied. "Do they have a school in Rattlesnake Springs?" Tucker shook his head. "No, madam, few families there, but most send their children to Tucson if they can afford it, or they don't send them at all." Grace frowned. It seemed a waste, children growing up without education simply because of geography. "Perhaps I could stay a few days and offer some lessons before continuing to Tucson." She felt Tucker's chest rumble with a chuckle. Always the teacher, Miss Jameson. I suppose so, she admitted with a smile. The sun was low on the horizon when they finally crested a ridge and saw Rattlesnake Springs spread out below them, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a crossroads, with scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding landscape. Not exactly Boston, Tucker said, a hint of apology in his voice. Grace took in the dusty streets and simple structures. No, she agreed, but it has its own charm. Their arrival drew curious stares from the townspeople. Grace was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, her once neat traveling suit covered in dust, her hair escaping its pins. Beside her, Tucker sat tall in the saddle, seemingly oblivious to the attention. He guided them to a two-story building with a neatly swept porch and window boxes filled with hardy desert flowers. A sign swinging from the eave read, "Henderson Boarding House." Tucker dismounted and helped Grace down, her legs wobbly after the long ride. Before he could knock, the door swung open to reveal a plump woman with silver-streaked dark hair. "Thomas O'Malley," she exclaimed, hands on her hips. "Haven't seen you in these parts for months." Tucker removed his hat. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Miss Jameson." Her stagecoach was attacked by Dryden's gang about 15 miles west. She needs a room for the night. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened as she turned to Grace. "You poor dear. Come in, come in. I'll have a bath drawn right away." Grace allowed herself to be ushered inside, glancing back at Tucker, who remained on the porch. "You're not staying?" she asked, surprised by her own disappointment. "Got business at the saloon," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "But I'll check on you in the morning, make sure you're settled." "Thank you," Grace said, meaning it from the bottom of her heart, "for everything." Tucker touched the brim of his hat, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "My pleasure, Miss Jameson." Mrs. Henderson's bathhouse was a small shed behind the main building, but the steaming water in the copper tub was the most welcome sight Grace had seen in days. She sank into it gratefully, letting the heat soothe her aching muscles and wash away the dust of the trail. By the time she finished and changed into the clean nightgown Mrs. Henderson had loaned her, a simple supper of beans, bread, and surprisingly tender beef was waiting in the boarding house's small dining room. "Tucker brought you a fair distance," Mrs. Henderson commented as she poured coffee. "Not many men would take the time with a stranger." "I'm very grateful he happened along when he did," Grace replied. "I'm not sure what would have become of me otherwise." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "He's got a good heart, that boy. Came through here half-starved when he was just a youngster. My Albert, God rest him, gave him work at the livery until he found his feet." Grace found herself hungry for information about her rescuer. "He mentioned he scouts for the cavalry, among other things. Boy never could stay in one place too long." Mrs. Henderson refilled Grace's coffee cup. "Reminds me of a wild horse, can be gentle enough when he chooses, but never truly broken to bridle." The comparison struck Grace as oddly fitting. There was something untamed about Tucker O'Malley, despite his courteous manners. After dinner, exhaustion hit her like a physical force. Mrs. Henderson showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the main street. Despite the strangeness of her surroundings and the events of the day, Grace fell asleep almost immediately. She woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the smell of bacon frying. For a moment, she was disoriented, expecting the familiar sounds of Boston outside her window instead of the occasional creak of wagon wheels and the distant lowing of cattle. After dressing in her spare travel outfit, thankfully packed in her bag rather than lost with the stagecoach luggage, Grace made her way downstairs. Mrs. Henderson was bustling around the kitchen, and two men in dusty work clothes were already seated at the table. "Morning, Miss Jameson," Mrs. Henderson greeted her. "Sleep well." "Wonderfully, thank you," Grace replied, accepting a cup of coffee. "Tucker stopped by earlier," the older woman informed her. "Said he'd be back midday to take you to see Sheriff Bailey about that stagecoach robbery." Grace's heart gave an unexpected leap at the mention of Tucker's name. She tamped down the feeling, attributing it to simple gratitude. "That's very thoughtful of him." After breakfast, Grace stepped outside, wanting to see more of the town in daylight. Rattlesnake Springs was indeed small, a general store, the saloon Tucker had mentioned, a livery stable, and a handful of other businesses lined the main street. Beyond them, perhaps 24 homes were scattered across the valley, with mountains rising blue in the distance. She had walked only a short distance when a young woman emerged from the general store, a little boy of about 4 clinging to her skirts. The woman's eyes widened in recognition. "You must be the lady Tucker brought in yesterday," she said, shifting her basket to extend a hand. "I'm Eliza Cooper." "This is my son, Samuel." Grace introduced herself, charmed by the friendly greeting. "Is news of my arrival the talk of the town, then?" Eliza laughed. "Nothing much happens in Rattlesnake Springs. A pretty lady arriving with Tucker O'Malley is bound to cause a stir." Grace felt her cheeks warm at being called pretty. "He was kind enough to help me after my stagecoach was attacked." "That sounds like Tucker," Eliza said with a nod. "He doesn't say much, but he's always been one to lend a hand when needed." She looked down as Samuel tugged at her skirt. "Yes, sweetheart, can I show the lady my book?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliza smiled indulgently. "If Miss Jameson doesn't mind." "I'd be delighted," Grace assured them. Samuel reached into his mother's basket and carefully extracted a dog-eared primer. He held it up proudly. "I can read some," he announced. Grace knelt to his level, genuinely pleased. "That's wonderful, Samuel. Reading is a very important skill." "Mama teaches me," he explained, "but sometimes the words are hard." "Samuel's bright as a new penny," Eliza said, running a hand over her son's hair. "I try my best, but I only had schooling till I was 12. An idea began to form in Grace's mind. "I'm actually a teacher," she told them, "on my way to take a position in Tucson." Eliza's eyes lit up. "Are you really? There are at least 10 children in town who could use some proper schooling. The Cooper homestead has a big front room we don't use much. I'm sure my husband wouldn't mind if you wanted to hold some lessons while you're here." The offer was tempting. Grace had planned to spend only a night or two in Rattlesnake Springs before finding transportation to Tucson, but the thought of helping these children, even briefly, appealed to her teacher's heart. "That's very generous," she said. "Let me think about it." They parted ways with promises to speak again soon. Grace continued her exploration of the town, eventually finding herself at the livery stable. The large doors stood open, and she could hear the sound of a hammer striking metal from within. Curiosity drew her inside, where she found Tucker bent over a workbench, repairing what looked like a harness. He glanced up at her entrance, surprise registering on his face before he broke into a warm smile. "Miss Jameson," he greeted her, setting down his tools. "Was just coming to find you after I finished here." "Mrs. Henderson said you'd stopped by," Grace replied, suddenly conscious of how she must look in her simple traveling dress, her hair neatly but plainly arranged. "I thought I would see a bit of the town while I waited." Tucker wiped his hands on a rag. "And what do you think of our little settlement?" "It's quaint," she said diplomatically. He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "That's a polite way of saying it's hardly more than a wide spot in the trail." Grace couldn't help but smile in return. "I met Mrs. Cooper and her son. She mentioned there are several children here without access to schooling." "A fair few," Tucker confirmed. Not enough to warrant building a schoolhouse, according to the county officials. Mrs. Cooper offered her home as a temporary classroom. Grace hesitated. I know I should continue to Tucson as soon as possible, but part of me feels I could do some good here, even if just for a week or two. Tucker studied her, his expression thoughtful. School board in Tucson isn't expecting you till the fall term starts, is it? Not for another 3 weeks, Grace admitted. Then what's the rush? He shrugged. Stagecoach comes through again next Wednesday, could take that one instead. The simplicity of his logic was appealing. What was the harm in staying a little while? Perhaps I will, she said, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since leaving Boston. Tucker grinned. Samuel Cooper's a lucky boy then, been begging for proper schooling since he learned his letters. They walked together to the sheriff's office, a small building with a single jail cell visible through the back window. Sheriff Bailey was a grizzled man with a limp and a perpetually suspicious expression, but he took Grace's statement about the stagecoach robbery with professional attention. Dryden's getting bolder, he commented to Tucker. Used to just hit freight wagons, now he's going after passengers. Man's desperate, Tucker replied. Army's been closing in on his hideouts. The sheriff nodded grimly. Still, attacking a stagecoach with a lady aboard. He tipped his hat to Grace. Begging your pardon, madam. Glad Tucker was nearby to assist. As am I, Grace agreed fervently. After leaving the sheriff's office, Tucker offered to show Grace around the rest of the town. It wasn't a lengthy tour, but his commentary brought the small settlement to life in a way her solitary exploration hadn't. He knew everyone, greeted them by name, and had a story for nearly every building. That's where old Peterson lost his thumb in a card game, he said, nodding toward the saloon. And over there's where Mrs. Fairchild's goat ate the mayor's best hat right off his head during last year's Founders' Day picnic. Grace laughed, charmed by the small-town tales. You seem to know everything about everyone, Tucker shrugged. Small place. Not much stays secret for long. They paused outside the general store where a notice board displayed various announcements and advertisements. Tucker pointed to one faded poster. Town dance next Saturday. Not quite a Boston social, but folks clean up nice, and Mrs. Henderson makes punch that'll knock your stockings off. Is that an invitation, Mr. O'Malley? Grace asked before she could stop herself. Tucker looked momentarily startled, then a slow smile spread across his face. I reckon it could be if you're interested. Grace felt a flutter of something dangerously like excitement. I'd be delighted to see what passes for society in Rattlesnake Springs. His eyes crinkled at the corners. It's settled then. I'll escort you to the dance. That afternoon, Grace met with Eliza Cooper and several other mothers to discuss holding temporary classes. The response was enthusiastic, with promises to spread the word to outlying farms and ranches. We can start Monday, Eliza suggested. Give everyone time to hear about it. Grace nodded, already mentally organizing lessons and grouping children by age and ability based on the mother's descriptions. I'll need some basic supplies, slates, chalk, perhaps some primers for those who don't have them. The general store has most of that, one of the women assured her. And we can all pitch in to cover the cost. By the time Grace returned to the boarding house for supper, she felt more energized than she had in months. The prospect of teaching again, even temporarily, awakened the passion that had driven her to become an educator in the first place. Mrs. Henderson greeted her with a knowing smile. Heard you're staying on a spell to teach the young ones. News travels fast, Grace observed. Like wildfire, the older woman agreed cheerfully. Tucker stopped by again. Said to tell you he's riding out to the Chapman place tomorrow, but would be honored if you join him for supper when he returns. Grace felt her cheeks warm. He said that. "Well, not in those exact words," Mrs. Henderson admitted, "but I know what he meant. Boy's not one for fancy talk." That night, as Grace prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on the unexpected turn her journey had taken. What had begun as a desperate flight from scandal in Boston had somehow led her to this dusty frontier town and to Tucker O'Malley, a man unlike any she had ever known. He was younger than her, perhaps 10 years or so, and from a world entirely different from her own. Yet there was something about him that drew her, something beyond his handsome face and the quiet strength he exuded. There was a genuineness to him, an absence of pretense that was refreshing after the stifling social constraints of Boston society. Grace shook her head, chiding herself for such thoughts. Whatever attraction she might feel was surely one-sided. Tucker had been kind, certainly, but he would have shown the same courtesy to any stranded traveler. And even if he did harbor some interest, the age difference alone would make any romantic entanglement inappropriate. With that sensible conclusion firmly in mind, Grace blew out her lamp and went to sleep, resolutely ignoring the flutter of anticipation she felt at the thought of dining with Tucker the following evening. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Grace spent hours preparing for her temporary school, creating lesson plans and organizing the Coopers' front room into a serviceable classroom. The town rallied behind her efforts, with donations of supplies appearing at the boarding house and offers of assistance from unexpected quarters. Even the gruff sheriff Bailey contributed, dropping off a stack of dog-eared adventure novels for the older boys who think they're too grown for schooling. Tucker, true to his word, rode out to the Chapman Ranch and didn't return until late the second day. Grace was helping Mrs. Henderson shell peas on the porch when he appeared, his horse dusty from the trail but his smile bright when he spotted her. "Miss Jameson," he called, dismounting with easy grace. "Still determined to educate the youth of Rattlesnake Springs?" "More than ever," she replied, returning his smile. "We start on Monday with 15 students confirmed." Tucker whistled low. "That's nearly every child in town and then some." "Word has spread," Grace acknowledged. "There's a real hunger for education here." He nodded, his expression turning serious. "These folks work hard for what little they have. Schooling's a luxury most can't afford to seek out in Tucson or Phoenix. Children shouldn't have to choose between an education and helping their families survive," Grace said firmly. Tucker studied her face, something warm and appreciative in his gaze. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Of course," Grace replied, puzzled. "Why wouldn't I?" he shrugged. "Just not used to folks from back east caring much about what happens out here in the territories." Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat pointedly. "Tucker, didn't you have something to ask Miss Jameson?" He shot the older woman a look that was half amusement, half exasperation. "Was getting to that, Mrs. H." Turning back to Grace, he removed his hat, suddenly looking younger and oddly vulnerable. "I was wondering if you might still be interested in that supper we discussed." Grace felt a ridiculous flutter in her chest. "I'd be delighted, Mr. O'Malley." His smile returned, brighter than before. "I'll clean up and be back in an hour if that suits you." "Perfectly," she assured him. True to his word, Tucker returned in exactly an hour, his hair still damp from washing and his usual trail-worn clothes replaced with a clean shirt and vest. He'd even polished his boots, Grace noted with a strange sense of pleasure. He escorted her to the town's only restaurant, a small establishment attached to the hotel that served simple but hearty food. The proprietor, a jovial man named Garcia, greeted Tucker like an old friend and led them to a table in the corner, somewhat removed from the other diners. "Best table in the house for the señor and his beautiful companion." Garcia declared with a flourish that suggested an earlier life in more sophisticated surroundings. Grace felt herself blush at being referred to as Tucker's companion, but said nothing to correct the assumption. Conversation flowed easily between them as they ate. Tucker told her about his travels through the territory, describing landscapes so vividly she could almost see them. In turn, Grace shared stories of Boston and her years teaching there, carefully avoiding any mention of the circumstances that had driven her west. "Why Tucson?" Tucker asked eventually, refilling her water glass. "Seems a long way to come for a teaching position." Grace hesitated, the familiar knot of shame and anger tightening in her stomach. "I needed a change," she said finally. "Boston has memories I'd rather leave behind." Tucker nodded, not pressing further. "Fresh starts are what the West is for," he said simply. His understanding, offered without judgment or curiosity, loosened something in Grace's chest. On impulse, she found herself explaining. "I was engaged," she said quietly, "to the headmaster of the school where I taught. He was well respected from a good family. Everyone thought it was a perfect match." Tucker waited patiently when she paused, his eyes never leaving her face. 6 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he had been involved with another teacher, a younger woman. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it." Grace stared at her plate, the hurt still fresh despite the months that had passed. "He said I should be grateful he was willing to marry me at all, given my age and modest circumstances." Tucker's expression darkened. "Sounds like a real gentleman," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I broke the engagement," Grace continued, "but the damage was done. Everyone knew what had happened or thought they did. There were whispers, glances. Even the children began to treat me differently." "So you came west," Tucker finished for her. Grace nodded. The Tucson school board was desperate for qualified teachers. They didn't ask many questions. "Their gain," Tucker said firmly. "That headmaster was a fool." The simple declaration, delivered with such conviction, brought a lump to Grace's throat. "Thank you," she managed. Tucker reached across the table, his hand covering hers briefly in a gesture of support. "For what it's worth, I think you're remarkable. Coming all this way alone, starting over, takes courage." Grace felt warmth spread through her at his words. "Or desperation," she said with a small smile. "Maybe both," Tucker allowed, returning her smile. As they walked back to the boarding house after dinner, the evening air cool against their skin, Grace found herself reluctant for the night to end. Tucker seemed to share the feeling, slowing his pace as they approached Mrs. Henderson's. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Grace said as they reached the porch. Tucker glanced up at the stars scattered across the velvet darkness of the desert sky. "Night's still young," he observed. "Thought I might show you something if you're not too tired." Curiosity overcame propriety. "What sort of something?" "Something beautiful," he promised. "But we'll need to take the horse. It's a short ride." Grace hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Let me fetch my shawl." Minutes later, she was once again seated before Tucker on his gray gelding, the town falling away behind them as they rode into the desert night. The moon was nearly full, bathing the landscape in silver light that transformed the familiar daytime scene into something magical. Tucker guided the horse to a low mesa about a mile from town. After helping Grace dismount, he led her to the edge where the land fell away to reveal a sweeping vista of the valley below, with mountains rising like shadowy sentinels in the distance. "Oh," Grace breathed, taking in the breathtaking view. "It's magnificent." Tucker nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Best view in the territory by my reckoning, especially on nights like this." They stood in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the gentle sighing of the desert wind and the occasional distant call of a coyote. Grace was acutely aware of Tucker beside her, solid and reassuring in the vastness of the night. "I come here to think," he said eventually. "When things get tangled in my mind." "And do you find answers?" Grace asked. Tucker smiled slightly. "Sometimes. Mostly I find perspective. Hard to stay troubled about small things when faced with all this." His words resonated with Grace. How many of her Boston concerns now seemed trivial from this distance. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said softly. Tucker turned to look at her, his expression difficult to read in the moonlight. "Seemed like something you'd appreciate." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Grace found herself wishing he would touch her, then immediately chastised herself for such improper longings. As if sensing her inner conflict, Tucker cleared his throat and stepped back slightly. "Should probably get you back before Mrs. Henderson sends out a search party." The ride back to town was quieter, a comfortable silence settling between them. When they reached the boarding house, Tucker helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Sleep well, Miss Jameson," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Good night, Mr. O'Malley," she replied. "And thank you again." Grace lay awake long into the night, replaying their evening together and trying to make sense of the feelings stirring within her. She was too sensible, too mature to be developing an attachment to a man she barely knew, especially one so much younger. Yet something about Tucker O'Malley touched her in ways no one ever had before. Monday morning arrived with a flutter of nervous excitement. Grace dressed with care in her most professional-looking outfit and arrived at the Cooper home an hour early to make final preparations. Eliza had arranged the front room admirably, with benches borrowed from the church and a small table that would serve as Grace's desk. The children began arriving shortly before 9, some shy and clinging to their mother's skirts, others boldly curious about their temporary teacher. They ranged in age from 5 to 14, a diverse group that would challenge Grace's teaching skills. "Good morning," she greeted them with her warmest smile. "I'm Miss Jameson, and I'm delighted to be your teacher for the next 2 weeks." By midday, Grace had assessed her students' abilities and divided them into 3 groups based on age and proficiency. The older children were surprisingly advanced in mathematics, but struggled with grammar and composition. The youngest needed the most basic instruction in letters and numbers. She was so absorbed in her work that she barely noticed the hours passing until Eliza appeared with a basket of food for the midday meal. "Thought you might need sustenance," she said with a smile. "The children, too." Grace gratefully accepted the offering. "You're a lifesaver, Mrs. Cooper." I completely lost track of time. Eliza's gaze shifted to the window. "Seems I'm not the only one checking on you today." Following her glance, Grace spotted Tucker on horseback across the street, watching the schoolhouse with evident interest. When he saw them notice him, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting before riding away. "He's been there a while," Eliza commented, a knowing gleam in her eye. Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. O'Malley has been very kind since my arrival." "Tucker's a good man," Eliza said. "Doesn't let many people get close, though, not since what happened with Lillian Thornton." Despite herself, Grace felt a spark of curiosity. Lillian Thornton. Eliza hesitated, clearly weighing discretion against the desire to share local history. It was 3 years back. Lillian was the daughter of a rancher over by Eagle Pass. Tucker worked for her father, fell hard for the girl. Folks thought they might marry. "What happened?" Grace asked, unable to stop herself. "Banker's son from Phoenix came courting with a fancy carriage and fancier promises. Lillian left with him the next day." Eliza shook her head. "Tucker didn't speak more than 10 words together for months afterward. The story made Grace's heart ache for the young Tucker, betrayed by someone he loved. It explained something of the wariness she occasionally glimpsed beneath his easy manner. "That's terribly sad," she said. Eliza nodded. "Which is why folks around here have taken notice of how he is with you. Nobody's seen Tucker show interest in a woman since Lillian left." Grace was saved from having to respond by the return of the children from their outdoor play. The afternoon passed in a flurry of lessons, with Grace working individually with each group while the others practiced their assignments. By the time the last child departed, she was exhausted but deeply satisfied. There was something profoundly rewarding about teaching children who were so eager to learn, who valued the opportunity she was providing. She was gathering her materials when a knock sounded at the open door. Tucker stood there, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncertain. "Heard the first day went well," he said. Grace smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. "It did. These children are remarkably bright." "Just needed someone to see it," Tucker replied. He shifted his weight, appearing uncharacteristically nervous. "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk. Weather's cooled some." The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. "I'd like that very much," Grace said, setting aside her books. They strolled through town and beyond, following a path that wound alongside the small creek that gave Rattlesnake Springs its name. The late afternoon light cast a golden glow over the landscape, softening the harsh edges of the desert terrain. "Eliza told me about Lillian Thornton," Grace said after they had walked in silence for a time. Tucker's step faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Did she now?" "I'm sorry," Grace said immediately. "It was gossip and I shouldn't have mentioned it." Tucker shook his head. "It's not a secret, just not something I talk about much." "Of course," Grace said, regretting having broached the subject. "Please forget I said anything." They walked a few more paces before Tucker spoke again. "I was 19, he said quietly. "Thought I knew everything. Thought she hung the moon and stars." Grace remained silent, sensing he needed to tell the story in his own way. "When she left, it felt like the ground disappeared from under me." His voice was matter-of-fact, the pain long since dulled to a manageable ache. "Took a while to find my footing again." "I understand," Grace said softly, thinking of her own heartbreak in Boston. Tucker glanced at her. "Reckon you do, at that." They continued walking, the silence between them comfortable once more. Eventually, Tucker guided them to a fallen log beside the creek, offering a place to rest. "You're good with those kids," he observed as they sat. "Saw Samuel Cooper this afternoon, couldn't stop talking about what he learned." Grace smiled, pleased. "They're eager students. It makes teaching them a joy." "You love it," Tucker said. "It wasn't a question." "I do," Grace confirmed. There's nothing quite like seeing a child grasp a new concept that moment when understanding dawns in their eyes. Tucker watched her face as she spoke, his expression warm. "It shows. When you talk about teaching, you light up inside." The observation, delivered with such simple honesty, touched Grace deeply. "My father used to say the same thing," she admitted. "He said I was born to teach, just as he was." "Smart man," Tucker commented, echoing his earlier assessment of her father. "He was," Grace agreed, memories of her father bringing both comfort and sadness. "He would have loved it out here, the openness, the possibility." They sat together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink. Tucker pointed out a family of quail moving through the underbrush, and showed her how to spot the nearly invisible desert lizards sunning themselves on nearby rocks. It was only when the first stars appeared that they reluctantly headed back toward town. As they approached the boarding house, Grace found herself wishing the evening could continue. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked impulsively. "Mrs. Henderson usually has a pot on the stove." Tucker hesitated, then shook his head regretfully. Best not. Got an early start tomorrow riding out to Fort Bowie with dispatches. Disappointment washed through Grace, stronger than it had any right to be. Of course. Another time, perhaps. Count on it, he said with a smile that warmed his eyes. And I haven't forgotten about that dance on Saturday. Neither have I, Grace assured him. He reached out, briefly touching her hand. Good night, Miss Jameson. Good night, Mr. O'Malley. The next 2 days passed without sight of Tucker, though Mrs. Henderson assured Grace he had indeed left for Fort Bowie as planned. She threw herself into teaching, developing more individualized lessons for her students and reveling in their progress. By Thursday afternoon, however, she found herself watching the road whenever a rider approached, hoping to see Tucker's familiar figure. She chided herself for such schoolgirl behavior, but the feeling persisted. Teachers distracted today, Eliza observed as she helped clean the classroom after the children had gone. Grace sighed, caught out. Is it that obvious? Only to someone looking, Eliza replied with a smile. He'll be back tomorrow or the next day. Tucker always keeps his word. I'm being ridiculous, Grace said, straightening a stack of slates with unnecessary precision. Mr. O'Malley has been kind, that's all. I'm reading far too much into simple courtesy. Eliza gave her a knowing look. If you say so. Friday morning brought rain unusual for the season and welcomed by the parched landscape. Grace and her students spent the day indoors, the steady patter on the roof creating a cozy atmosphere conducive to learning. She was just dismissing the children when the door opened, and Tucker stepped inside, his coat dark with moisture and his boots muddy from the trail. Mr. O'Malley, Grace exclaimed, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. The children chorused greetings, several of the boys clustering around Tucker with questions about his journey. He answered them patiently, his eyes finding Grace's over their heads. When the last student had departed, Tucker approached her desk, removing his hat. Miss Jameson, he greeted her, his voice warm. Hope I'm not interrupting your work. Not at all, she assured him. We were just finishing for the day. How was your trip to Fort Bowie? Uneventful, he replied. Best kind of journey out here. Grace nodded, suddenly feeling shy under his steady gaze. Will you be staying in town now? She asked, trying to sound merely conversational. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. For a while. Got some business with the livery, and there's a dance tomorrow night I'm looking forward to. Is there? Grace said lightly. I believe I heard something about that. Tucker's smile broadened. I was hoping my invitation still stood. It does, Grace confirmed, her heart beating a little faster. Good. He glanced around the classroom. Looks like you've made a real school here. Grace followed his gaze, taking in the children's work displayed on the walls and the carefully organized learning materials. It's coming along nicely. The children are making wonderful progress. Thanks to you, Tucker said. Town's buzzing about it. Sheriff Bailey says he overheard some of the council members talking about maybe building a proper schoolhouse after all. Surprise and pleasure washed through Grace. Really? That would be wonderful for the children. Tucker nodded. Might need a teacher to go with that schoolhouse. The implication hung in the air between them. Grace felt a flutter of something like hope, quickly tempered by practical considerations. I have a contract with the Tucson School Board, she reminded him. Course you do, Tucker agreed readily. Just thought you might like to know you've made an impression here. Before Grace could respond, Eliza appeared at the door. Thought I heard voices, she said, looking between them with thinly veiled interest. Tucker, good to see you back safe. Mrs. Cooper, he greeted her with a nod. Was just telling Miss Jameson how well her teaching's been received in town. Eliza beamed. Samuel's reading to his father every night now. John can hardly believe it. The conversation turned to other children's progress, and soon Tucker was taking his leave, citing his business at the livery. At the door, he paused. "I'll call for you at 7 tomorrow," he said to Grace. "For the dance." "I'll be ready," she promised. After he left, Eliza raised an eyebrow at Grace. "Still think you're reading too much into things?" Grace busied herself gathering her papers. "He's being neighborly." Eliza laughed. "Tucker O'Malley hasn't attended a town dance since Lillian Thornton, but if you say it's just neighborliness." The observation left Grace with a confusing mixture of hope and apprehension. Could Tucker truly be interested in her romantically? And if he was, what then? She was too old for him, too settled in her ways. And she was committed to her position in Tucson, a commitment she couldn't in good conscience abandon. Yet as she prepared for bed that night, Grace couldn't deny the anticipation she felt at the thought of tomorrow's dance. For the first time since leaving Boston, she found herself genuinely looking forward to something, or rather, to someone. Saturday dawned clear and crisp, the previous day's rain having washed the dust from the air. Grace spent the morning helping Mrs. Henderson with household chores, then devoted the afternoon to preparing for the dance. She had brought only 2 good dresses with her, her traveling outfit, and a more formal blue silk that she had packed for social occasions in Tucson. The silk was perhaps too elegant for a small-town dance, but it was her only option beyond her everyday clothes. Mrs. Henderson helped her dress, skillfully arranging Grace's hair in a style more elaborate than her usual simple knot. "There," the older woman said, stepping back to admire her work. "Tucker won't know what hit him." Grace examined her reflection in the small mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The blue silk complemented her eyes and fair coloring, and Mrs. Henderson's efforts with her hair had softened her appearance considerably. "You think it's too much?" she asked anxiously. "I don't want to appear overdressed." Mrs. Henderson shook her head firmly. "You look beautiful, dear. And it's about time this town saw something besides calico and homespun." At precisely 7 o'clock, a knock sounded at the front door. Grace's heart leapt into her throat as she heard Mrs. Henderson greeting Tucker and inviting him inside. Taking a deep breath, Grace descended the stairs. Tucker stood in the entryway, his back to her, as he conversed with Mrs. Henderson. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His usually unruly dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He turned as he heard her approach, and the expression that crossed his face made Grace's breath catch. It was more than simple appreciation. It was as if he were seeing something precious and unexpected. "Miss Jameson," he said, his voice slightly rough. "You look beautiful." The sincerity in his tone brought warmth to Grace's cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley. You're quite handsome yourself." Tucker grinned, some of his usual ease returning. "Cleaned up all right, didn't I? Very presentable indeed," Grace agreed with a smile. Mrs. Henderson observed their exchange with evident satisfaction. "You two better get going. Dancing will have started by now." The town hall, a modest building that served multiple purposes for the community, had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the crowded space. A small group of musicians occupied one corner, playing a lively tune on fiddle, guitar, and harmonica. Their entrance caused a momentary lull in conversation as heads turned to observe them. Grace felt a flutter of self-consciousness at being the center of attention, but Tucker's hand at the small of her back was reassuring. "Quite the stir we're causing," he murmured close to her ear. "Is it the dress?" Grace asked, suddenly worried she had misjudged. Tucker shook his head. "It's you," he said simply. "And maybe a little bit me. Town's not used to seeing me at these gatherings. Before Grace could respond, they were approached by Sheriff Bailey and a plump, pleasant-faced woman he introduced as his wife. "Miss Jameson, good to see you again," the sheriff said. "Heard nothing but praise for your teaching." "Thank you, Sheriff," Grace replied. "The children have been a delight to teach." Mrs. Bailey beamed at her. "Samuel Cooper told my Margaret all about the history lesson you gave, something about ancient Egypt. She was fascinated." The conversation continued in this vein, with various townspeople approaching to express their appreciation for Grace's work with the children. Tucker remained at her side throughout, his quiet presence a comfort in the unfamiliar social setting. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Tucker turned to her. "May I have this dance, Miss Jameson?" Grace hesitated briefly. "I should warn you, it's been some time since I've danced." Tucker smiled. "Then we're evenly matched. Been years for me, too." He led her onto the floor, his hand warm and steady against hers. When he placed his other hand at her waist, Grace felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the propriety of their position. They moved together with surprising ease, Tucker guiding her through the steps with more grace than she had expected from a man who spent most of his life on horseback. "You dance very well for someone out of practice," Grace observed. Tucker's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Ma insisted all her boys learn, said it was part of being a gentleman." "She taught you well," Grace said sincerely. As the evening progressed, they danced several more times, conversed with various townspeople, and sampled Mrs. Henderson's infamous punch, which lived up to its reputation for potency. During a brief respite from dancing, Tucker brought Grace a cup of water and led her to a quieter corner of the hall. "Having a good time?" he asked, his expression earnest. "Wonderful," Grace assured him. "Everyone has been so welcoming." Tucker nodded. "They like you. Not just what you're doing for the children, but you." The simple statement touched Grace deeply. "I like them too," she admitted, "more than I expected to." Something flickered in Tucker's eyes, hope, perhaps. Enough to consider staying. The question caught Grace off guard. I don't know," she said honestly. "My position in Tucson." "I understand," Tucker said quickly. "Just thought I'd ask." Before Grace could respond, Eliza Cooper approached, her cheeks flushed from dancing. "Miss Jameson, the girls want to show you the quilt they're working on for the Harvest Festival. It's in the back room if you have a moment." Grateful for the interruption, Grace excused herself and followed Eliza. The girls, a group of women ranging from 16 to 60, had indeed created a beautiful quilt, each square representing an aspect of life in Rattlesnake Springs. Grace admired it appropriately, but her mind remained on Tucker's question and the implications behind it. Was he suggesting she stay simply for the sake of the children's education, or was there a more personal motivation? When she returned to the main hall, she couldn't immediately locate Tucker. Sheriff Bailey informed her that Tucker had stepped outside for some air. Following this direction, Grace found him leaning against the porch railing, gazing up at the star-filled sky. "Everything all right?" she asked, joining him. Tucker glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Just needed a moment," he said. "Gets crowded in there." Grace nodded, understanding. "It's a beautiful night." "That it is," Tucker agreed, his gaze returning to the heavens. They stood in silence for a time, the music and laughter from inside creating a distant backdrop to the peace of the night. "I apologize if my question made you uncomfortable," Tucker said eventually. "About staying in Rattlesnake Springs." Grace turned to face him fully. "It didn't make me uncomfortable, it just caught me by surprise." Tucker nodded, still not looking at her. "Town needs a teacher," he said. "Those kids deserve someone like you." "Is that the only reason you'd want me to stay?" Grace asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Now Tucker did look at her, his eyes intense even in the darkness. "No," he said simply, "but it's the only one I've got any right to mention." Grace's heart began to beat faster. "What are the others?" Tucker straightened, turning to face her. "I think you know," he said quietly. "I'd like to hear you say it," Grace replied, hardly recognizing her own voice. For a long moment, Tucker was silent, as if weighing his words carefully. Then, with characteristic directness, he said, "I'd want you to stay because in the short time you've been here, you've become important to me, because I look forward to seeing you each day, because when I'm with you I feel settled in a way I never have before." The confession, delivered without embellishment or flowery language, moved Grace deeply. "Tucker," he shook his head, "I know what you're going to say. I'm too young for you. You have obligations in Tucson. We barely know each other." "All true," Grace acknowledged. "But," Tucker prompted, hearing the unspoken qualification in her tone. Grace took a deep breath. "But I feel something too, something I didn't expect and don't quite know what to do with." Tucker stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. "We could figure it out together," he suggested, his voice low. Grace looked up at him, her heart pounding. "I'm 35, she said bluntly. "You can't be more than 25. 26 next month, Tucker corrected with a hint of a smile. "Still nearly 10 years difference," Grace insisted. Tucker's expression grew serious. "Does that matter so much? Out here, people don't measure life the same way they do back east. It's not about how many years you've lived, but how you've lived them." "It's not that simple," Grace protested, though she found herself wanting to believe him. "Could be," Tucker said, "if we let it." Before Grace could formulate a response, the door opened, spilling light and noise onto the porch. A group of revelers emerged, laughing and talking animatedly. The moment broken, Tucker offered Grace his arm. "Shall we go back inside? I believe you promised me another dance." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of music and conversation, the unresolved tension between them adding an undercurrent of excitement to every interaction. When the dance finally ended near midnight, Tucker escorted Grace back to the boarding house, their path lit by moonlight and the occasional lantern hanging outside a business. At Mrs. Henderson's porch, they paused, neither quite ready for the evening to end. "Thank you for a wonderful time," Grace said, breaking the silence. Tucker nodded. "My pleasure." He hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. "Grace," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I meant what I said earlier about you being important to me." Grace looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers. "I know you did," she said softly, "and it means more than I can say." Tucker's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "But you're still leaving for Tucson." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "I have a contract, a commitment." "I understand," Tucker said, and she could tell he truly did. "When will you go?" "The stagecoach comes Wednesday," Grace replied, the reality of her departure suddenly sharp and painful. Tucker nodded, his expression resigned but determined. "Then we have 3 more days." "3 days for what?" Grace asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "To convince you that what's between us is worth exploring," Tucker said simply. "If I fail, at least I'll know I tried." The boldness of his declaration left Grace speechless. Before she could recover, Tucker raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Grace," he said, releasing her hand and stepping back. "Good night, Tucker," she managed, her skin tingling where his lips had touched. He waited until she was safely inside before departing, his boots making soft sounds on the packed earth of the street. Mrs. Henderson, who had clearly been waiting up, appeared in the hallway with a knowing smile. "Have a nice time, did you?" "Lovely," Grace replied distractedly, her mind still on Tucker's parting words. The older woman's expression softened. "He's a good man, Grace, better than most around these parts." "I know," Grace said quietly, But you're still planning to leave, Mrs. Henderson observed. Grace sighed. I have obligations in Tucson. Obligations, Mrs. Henderson repeated. Important things, obligations. But so is happiness. With that cryptic comment, she bid Grace good night and retreated to her own room, leaving Grace to her troubled thoughts. Sunday morning found Grace at the small church on the edge of town, seeking guidance or at least clarity in the familiar rituals of worship. The service was simpler than those she had attended in Boston, but the message of faith and community resonated deeply. Tucker sat several rows behind her, his presence felt rather than seen. Grace resisted the urge to turn and look at him, focusing instead on Reverend Davis's sermon about finding purpose in unexpected places. After the service, as congregants gathered outside to socialize, Tucker approached her, hat in hand. "Miss Jameson," he greeted her, returning to formality in the public setting. "Mr. O'Malley," she replied with a small smile. He gestured toward the road leading out of town. "Thought you might like to see something. Won't take long." Curiosity piqued, Grace agreed, excusing herself from the group of mothers she had been conversing with. Tucker offered his arm and they set off at a leisurely pace. "Where are we going?" Grace asked after they had walked a short distance. "Town's got a piece of land," Tucker explained. "Just past the cemetery. Been sitting empty for years." They continued in silence until they reached a small clearing bordered by cottonwood trees. The location was peaceful, with a view of the mountains to the west and the town visible to the east. "This is it," Tucker said, stopping in the center of the clearing. Grace looked around, puzzled. "It's very nice, but what exactly am I looking at?" Tucker's expression was earnest. "The town council met this morning before church. They've decided to build a schoolhouse here." Surprise and pleasure washed through Grace. "That's wonderful news. They're hoping to have it ready by spring," Tucker continued, "and they've authorized the hiring of a full-time teacher." Understanding dawned. "Tucker." He held up a hand. "I'm just the messenger. Sheriff Bailey asked me to show you the site, see what you thought of it." Grace surveyed the clearing again, this time imagining a small schoolhouse filled with eager students. It was an appealing vision. "It's a perfect location," she admitted. "Close enough to town for convenience but quiet enough for learning." Tucker nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "That's what I told them." They stood in silence for a moment, the implications hanging between them. "I still have my position in Tucson," Grace said finally. "I know," Tucker replied. "Just thought you should have all the information before you make your final decision." His consideration touched her. He wasn't pressuring her or making demands, simply ensuring she knew all her options. "Thank you for showing me," Grace said sincerely. Tucker offered his arm again. "Shall we head back? Mrs. Henderson always puts on quite a spread after church." The remainder of Sunday passed pleasantly, with Grace dividing her time between helping Mrs. Henderson prepare for the week's boarders and organizing her lessons for what would be her final days of teaching in Rattlesnake Springs. Tucker disappeared after the midday meal, mentioning business at the livery that couldn't wait. Grace tried not to feel disappointed by his absence, reminding herself that he had responsibilities that had nothing to do with her. Monday morning brought a surprise, a small bouquet of wildflowers on her desk at the schoolroom, with a simple note. "For the best teacher Rattlesnake Springs has ever known. T.O." The gesture brought a smile to Grace's face that lasted throughout the morning's lessons. When the children went outside for their midday break, Eliza approached Grace's desk. "Those are pretty," she commented, nodding toward the flowers. "Tucker's work," Grace nodded, not bothering to deny it. Eliza studied her face. "You care for him?" It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "More than is sensible given the circumstances." "Love rarely is sensible," Eliza observed with a small smile. John was 19 when we married. I was 27. Grace looked up in surprise. I didn't realize. Most don't notice, Eliza said with a shrug. It doesn't matter much once you've been together a while. The years have a way of evening things out. The revelation gave Grace pause. She had been so focused on the age difference between herself and Tucker, seeing it as an insurmountable obstacle. But perhaps it was only as significant as they allowed it to be. The afternoon brought another surprise: Tucker himself, arriving as the children were being dismissed. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. O'Malley," Grace greeted him, aware of the curious glances from her departing students. "Thank you for the flowers. They're lovely." Tucker smiled, seeming pleased by her acknowledgement. "Glad you like them. Got something else for you." He handed her the package. "Open it when you have a moment." Grace accepted the parcel, intrigued. "Will you wait while I do?" Tucker shook his head. "Got to help Garcia repair his wagon, but I'll call on you this evening if that's all right." "I'd like that," Grace replied. After the last child had gone and she had tidied the classroom, Grace finally sat down to open Tucker's gift. Inside the paper was a small, leather-bound book of poetry, Wordsworth, one of her favorites. A slip of paper marked one of the pages. Opening to it, Grace found the poem "She Was a Phantom of Delight," with certain lines underlined. A perfect woman, nobly planned, to warn, to comfort and command, and yet a spirit still, and bright with something of angelic light. The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Grace's eyes. How had he known she loved poetry? Had she mentioned it during one of their conversations? That evening, when Tucker called at the boarding house, Grace was waiting on the porch, the book of poetry in her lap. "How did you know?" she asked as he climbed the steps to join her. Tucker smiled, removing his hat. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you were always reading poetry back in Boston. Had to send to Tucson for that particular volume, but Mr. Garcia was heading that way anyway." The fact that he had gone to such trouble, that he had listened and remembered something so personal, touched Grace deeply. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's a perfect gift." Tucker sat beside her on the porch swing. "Read me something," he requested. "Always liked the sound of poetry, even if I don't always understand the fancy words." Grace opened the book to one of her favorites and began to read, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. Tucker listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, as if absorbing the words. "That's how I feel about you," he said finally. "Like all those beautiful words, even though I couldn't have said them that way myself." Grace closed the book, her heart racing. "Tucker." "I know," he said, understanding in his voice. "You're leaving day after tomorrow, but I had to tell you anyway." Grace looked at him, this man who had come to mean so much to her in such a short time. What was she really returning to in Tucson? A job, yes, but no friends, no connections, nothing but work and solitude. Here in Rattlesnake Springs, in just 2 weeks, she had found purpose, community, and something else, something unexpected and precious, with the man sitting beside her. "I'm afraid," she admitted softly. Tucker reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Of what?" "Of making another mistake. Of trusting feelings that might not last." Grace swallowed hard. "Of the difference in our ages becoming a burden rather than a detail." Tucker considered her words carefully before responding. "Can't promise we won't face challenges," he said honestly. "No one can, but I can promise I'll face them with you, not run from them." He shifted to look at her more directly. "As for your age, Grace, when I look at you, I don't see a number. I see a woman of strength and grace and wisdom. Someone who makes me want to be better than I am." His sincerity was unmistakable, his words unembellished but deeply felt. Grace found herself wavering, the decision she had thought settled suddenly uncertain again. "I need time," she said finally, "to think clearly." Tucker nodded, releasing her hand. "Fair enough." He rose to leave, then paused. "Just one more thing to consider." "What's that?" He looked at her, his expression serious but with a hint of that boyish charm she had come to cherish. "I'm falling in love with you, Grace Jameson. Have been since you ducked behind that overturned stagecoach and looked at me like I was either salvation or another problem to solve." The declaration, delivered with such straightforward honesty, left Grace speechless. Tucker settled his hat back on his head. "Sleep well," he said quietly, and descended the porch steps, leaving Grace with a tumult of emotions and a decision that suddenly seemed impossible to make. Tuesday dawned bright and clear, Grace's last full day in Rattlesnake Springs. She approached her teaching with bittersweet determination, wanting to give her students as much as possible in their final hours together. The children, sensing her impending departure, were both attentive and subdued. Little Samuel Cooper presented her with a carefully drawn picture of the schoolroom, with Grace depicted at the front, impossibly tall and crowned with what appeared to be a halo. "So you remember us," he explained solemnly. Grace knelt to hug him, blinking back tears. "I could never forget you, Samuel. Or any of you," she added, looking around at the faces of her temporary students. The day passed too quickly. Before she knew it, she was standing before the assembled children and their parents, saying her goodbyes. "You have all been wonderful students," she told them, her voice steady despite the emotion welling inside her. "Remember what we've learned together and never stop seeking knowledge." There were tears and hugs, promises to write, and heartfelt thanks from the parents. Through it all, Grace maintained her composure, though her heart grew heavier with each farewell. As the last family departed, Eliza lingered behind. "Will you at least consider the schoolhouse position?" she asked. "The council is prepared to match Tuckson's offer." Grace sighed. "It's tempting," she admitted. "More tempting than I expected." Eliza studied her face. "Is it the school that's tempting or something else?" "Both," Grace acknowledged honestly. "But I've made commitments. I can't simply abandon them because my feelings have changed." "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is change our minds," Eliza said gently. "Not out of fear or weakness, but because we've found something better than what we planned." With those words, she embraced Grace and left her alone in the schoolroom that had become so dear to her in such a short time. Grace was gathering her belongings when Tucker appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Heard the goodbyes were pretty tearful," he said, entering the room. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Tucker moved to help her, collecting the books she had borrowed from various townspeople. "You made a difference here," he said quietly, "even in just 2 weeks." "They made a difference to me too," Grace replied, finally finding her words. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the simple task of tidying the classroom providing a focus for their restless emotions. "I won't be seeing you off tomorrow," Tucker said abruptly. "Got to ride out to the Chapman place again. Problem with their well." Grace looked up, disappointment sharp in her chest. "Oh." Tucker met her gaze, his eyes revealing what his casual tone had attempted to hide. This was painful for him too. "Figured it might be easier that way. For both of us." Grace wanted to protest, to ask him to be there, but she understood his reasoning. Perhaps a clean break would be kinder. "Will you at least walk me back to Mrs. Henderson's?" she asked. Tucker nodded, taking the bundle of books from her arms. "Course." They walked slowly, neither in a hurry to reach their destination. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, painting the simple buildings of Rattlesnake Springs in gold and amber. "It's beautiful here," Grace observed, "in its own way." Tucker followed her gaze. Grows on you, he agreed. Wasn't sure about it myself at first. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. The implications of his statement hung between them, unaddressed but deeply felt. When they reached the boarding house, Tucker set her books on the porch swing and turned to face her. I meant what I said last night, he said, his voice low. About my feelings for you, Grace nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I know you did. And I respect your decision, he continued. Whatever it is, just wanted you to know that. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and feelings too new and fragile to fully express. Finally, Tucker stepped closer, his hand gently cupping her cheek. May I? He asked, his intention clear. Instead of answering, Grace closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with the weight of their shared emotions. Tucker's arms encircled her, drawing her closer. Grace felt as though something within her that had been tightly coiled for years was finally releasing, allowing her to truly feel again. When they eventually parted, both slightly breathless, Tucker rested his forehead against hers. I'll be thinking of you, he murmured, wherever you are. And I you, Grace whispered, her heart aching with the knowledge that this might be their first and last embrace. Tucker kissed her once more, briefly but tenderly, then stepped back. Goodbye, Grace, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Goodbye, Tucker, she replied, watching as he walked away, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Inside, Mrs. Henderson took one look at Grace's face and wordlessly poured her a cup of tea, adding a generous splash of something stronger from a bottle kept on a high shelf. Drink, she instructed. Then we'll talk if you want to. Grace sipped the fortified tea, grateful for both the warmth and the slight burn of alcohol. He's not seeing me off tomorrow, she said after a while. Mrs. Henderson nodded. Probably for the best. Those goodbyes never get easier, no matter how many times you say them. Have there been many? Grace asked, curious despite her sadness. Goodbyes, I mean. A few, the older woman acknowledged. My Albert was my second husband, first died of fever back in Ohio. Thought my heart would never mend. But it did, Grace observed. Mrs. Henderson smiled slightly. Differently, but yes, found room for Albert, though I never stopped loving James. How did you know, Grace asked, that it was right to open your heart again? The older woman considered the question. Didn't know exactly, just realized one day that the risk of loving again hurt less than the certainty of being alone. Grace pondered this as she finished her tea. I'm afraid, she admitted, of making another mistake. Of letting feelings cloud my judgment. Sometimes feelings are the clearest judgment we have, Mrs. Henderson replied. Head's important, sure, but so's the heart. They talked long into the evening, Mrs. Henderson sharing stories of her life and loves, Grace gradually revealing more of her own past the broken engagement in Boston, her parents' deaths, the loneliness that had driven her west as much as the need for a fresh start. By the time Grace retired to her room, her mind was no less troubled, but her heart felt lighter for having shared its burden. Morning came too soon. Grace dressed carefully in her traveling suit, packed her few belongings, and descended to the dining room where Mrs. Henderson had prepared a hearty breakfast. Eat, the older woman instructed. Long journey ahead. Grace did her best, though anxiety had robbed her of appetite. The stagecoach would arrive at 10, and already she could hear the town coming to life outside, wagons rolling by, voices calling greetings, the normal rhythm of the day beginning. A knock at the door startled her. Mrs. Henderson answered it and returned with Sheriff Bailey. Morning, Miss Jameson, he greeted her. Came to escort you to the stage. Town council thought you deserved a proper send-off. Grace thanked him, touched by the gesture even as her heart sank at the confirmation that Tucker would indeed not be there to say goodbye. When they stepped outside, Grace was astonished to find nearly the entire town gathered in the street. Her students stood in a neat row, each holding a small token flowers, a carefully drawn picture, a smooth stone found by the creek. "We wanted to thank you," Eliza explained, stepping forward, "for everything you've done for our children." One by one, the students presented their gifts, each accompanied by a shy word of thanks or a quick embrace. Grace accepted them all, her vision blurring with unshed tears. The stagecoach arrived precisely on time, dust billowing around its wheels as it came to a stop before the boarding house. The driver secured Grace's trunk while Sheriff Bailey helped her stow her smaller bags inside. "All set, miss," the driver called. "Next stop, Tucson." Grace turned to face the assembled townspeople, her heart full to bursting. "Thank you," she said simply, "for welcoming me, for trusting me with your children, for making these 2 weeks some of the most meaningful of my life." She scanned the crowd one last time, unable to suppress the hope that Tucker might appear at the last moment. But there was no sign of him. With a final wave, Grace allowed Sheriff Bailey to hand her into the stagecoach. The door closed with a solid thunk, and the driver called to the horses. The stagecoach lurched forward, beginning the journey that would take her away from Rattlesnake Springs and away from Tucker O'Malley. Grace leaned out the window, watching as the town receded behind her. The children ran alongside the coach for a short distance, waving and calling farewells until Eliza gathered them back. Soon the buildings gave way to open desert, the road stretching ahead toward Tucson and the life she had planned before fate intervened in the form of stagecoach robbers and a handsome young man with eyes the color of a summer storm. The stagecoach had traveled perhaps 5 miles when Grace noticed a rider approaching from the east, moving fast across the desert landscape. Her heart leapt with recognition. Even before she could make out his features, she would know that silhouette anywhere. "Driver," she called, "please stop." The driver glanced back, frowning. "Something wrong, madam?" "Someone's coming," Grace explained, pointing to the approaching rider. "Please, just for a moment." Grumbling about schedules, the driver nevertheless brought the stagecoach to a halt. Grace flung open the door and descended, her eyes fixed on Tucker as he galloped toward them. He reined in his horse sharply, dust swirling around them as he dismounted in one fluid motion. For a moment, they simply stood looking at each other, both breathing hard from different exertions. "I thought you weren't coming," Grace said finally. Tucker removed his hat, his hair tousled and his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Wasn't planning to," he admitted. "Then realized I'd regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't try one more time." "Try what?" "To convince you to stay." Tucker took a step closer. "I love you, Grace. I know it's fast and maybe it doesn't make sense, but it's true." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. "Tucker, just hear me out," he interrupted. "I'm not asking you to give up teaching. That schoolhouse is going to be built, and the job is yours if you want it. And I'm not making light of the difference in our ages. But I do know that when I'm with you, everything makes sense in a way it never has before." He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his. "I'm asking you to take a chance on us, on this town, on a life that might be different from what you planned but could be everything you need." Grace looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there and the vulnerability. This man, who had made his own way in the world since he was 15, was laying his heart bare for her. "I'm afraid," she whispered. Tucker nodded. "Me too," he admitted, "but some things are worth being afraid for." In that moment, with the desert stretching endlessly around them and the stagecoach driver impatiently checking his pocket watch, Grace finally understood what her heart had been trying to tell her for days. "I am too old for you," she whispered, echoing the fear that had held her back. Tucker smiled softly, bringing one hand up to cup her cheek. "Then let me be young enough for both of us," he murmured, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. When they parted, Grace knew her decision was made. It might not be the sensible choice or the one she had planned, but it was the right one. "Driver," she called, turning toward the stagecoach. "I believe I'll need my luggage back." The driver's eyebrows shot up, but he made no comment as he began to unload her trunk. Tucker watched her, hope dawning in his eyes. "You're staying?" he asked, as if needing to hear the words. Grace smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'm staying," she confirmed. "For the children, for the school." She paused, meeting his gaze directly. "And for you." Tucker's answering smile was radiant. He lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her in a circle that made her laugh with pure joy. "Put me down, you ridiculous man," she protested, though her tone belied her words. Tucker obeyed but kept his arms around her. "You won't regret this," he promised. "I'll make sure of it." Grace touched his face, marveling at the turn her life had taken. "I know," she said simply. They returned to Rattlesnake Springs together, Grace perched on Tucker's horse while he led the animal on foot. News of her decision spread through town even before they arrived, and by the time they reached the main street, a small crowd had gathered to welcome her back. Mrs. Henderson stood on her porch, arms folded and a satisfied smile on her face. "Knew you'd figure it out eventually," she declared as they approached. "Figured you might need your room back," she added to Grace. "Kept it ready just in case." Grace embraced the older woman, overwhelmed by the welcome and by the certainty that she had made the right choice. That evening, as they sat together on Mrs. Henderson's porch swing, Grace leaned her head against Tucker's shoulder. "What happens now?" she asked. Tucker's arm tightened around her. "Well, there's a schoolhouse to build. And I was thinking of expanding the livery, maybe adding a proper blacksmith shop." "And us?" Grace pressed. "What happens with us?" Tucker considered the question. "Reckon we take our time, get to know each other better, do things proper." He glanced down at her. "Though I should warn you, I don't plan on waiting too long before asking you to marry me." Grace laughed, the sound bright in the evening air. "Is that so?" Tucker confirmed. "I'm thinking by Christmas. That gives you a few months to get used to the idea." "Very generous of you," Grace said dryly. Tucker grinned, unrepentant. "I can be a patient man when needed." Grace turned her face up to his. "And what if I don't need that much time?" His expression softened. "Then I'd say we're both mighty fortunate." As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead might not be the one she had envisioned, but it was the one her heart had chosen. With Tucker beside her and a community that had already embraced her as their own, the future looked brighter than she could have imagined. "I love you," she said softly, the words coming easily now that she had accepted their truth. Tucker kissed her gently. "And I love you," he replied. "Age and all." Grace smiled against his lips. "Then I suppose we'll just have to make the best of it." "I reckon we will," Tucker agreed, pulling her closer as the desert night enfolded them in its quiet beauty. 3 years later, Grace O'Malley stood at the door of the Rattlesnake Springs schoolhouse, watching as her students filed out for the day. The building, sturdy and welcoming with its large windows and polished floors, had been completed just as promised, with Tucker overseeing much of the construction himself. "Mrs. O'Malley," Samuel Cooper called, running back from the gate. "I almost forgot to give you this." He pressed a slightly crumpled envelope into her hand. "Pa said to make sure you got it today." Grace thanked him, curious about the special delivery. Opening the envelope, she found a simple note in Tucker's distinctive handwriting. "Meet me where it all began. Bring Emma. T." A smile spread across her face. Tucker had been mysteriously absent that morning, claiming business in town, but the gleam in his eye had suggested something more. Grace gathered her things and collected their daughter, Emma, from Mrs. Henderson, who had gladly taken on the role of doting grandmother to the 6-month-old. "Tucker sent for you, did he?" the older woman asked, handing over the sleeping infant. "You know about this?" Grace asked, not really surprised. Mrs. Henderson merely smiled. "Best not keep him waiting." With Emma secure in her arms, Grace made her way to the spot where Tucker had found her 3 years before the site of the stagecoach robbery that had changed the course of her life. As she approached, she saw him waiting, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Beside him stood his gray gelding and, to Grace's surprise, a small covered wagon. "What's all this?" she asked as she reached him. Tucker grinned, taking Emma from her arms and placing a gentle kiss on the baby's downy head before turning to kiss Grace properly. "Happy anniversary," he said. "3 years ago today, I found a Boston schoolteacher hiding behind a broken-down stagecoach." Grace smiled, touched that he had remembered the exact date. "And I found a cowboy with more courage than sense, facing down outlaws single-handed." Tucker laughed. "Worked out pretty well for both of us, I'd say." He gestured to the wagon. "Thought we might have a picnic to celebrate." "Just the 3 of us." Inside the wagon, he had arranged blankets and pillows, creating a comfortable nest alongside a basket that Grace knew would contain Mrs. Henderson's best cooking. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it with all her heart. They settled in the shade of the wagon, Emma sleeping peacefully between them as they shared the meal and memories of the past 3 years, their courtship, their Christmas wedding, the building of their home on the edge of town, and the birth of their daughter the previous spring. "Any regrets?" Tucker asked eventually, his tone light but his eyes serious. Grace considered the question, thinking of the life she had nearly chosen teaching in Tucson, perhaps eventually returning to Boston, always carrying the weight of what might have been. "Not one," she said honestly. "Every day I spend with you and Emma, every day teaching those children and being part of this community, confirms that I made the right choice." Tucker's expression softened. "Even when I track mud into the house and forget to fix that loose board on the porch," Grace laughed. "Even then." He reached across their sleeping daughter to take Grace's hand. "I love you, Mrs. O'Malley, more today than yesterday and not as much as tomorrow." "And I love you," Grace replied, the words as true now as the first time she had spoken them. "Age difference and all." Tucker grinned. "Funny how that doesn't seem to matter much anymore." "It never really did," Grace admitted. "It was just an excuse to protect my heart when I was afraid to risk it again." "Glad you took the risk," Tucker said, his voice husky with emotion. Grace squeezed his hand, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had shown her that sometimes the unexpected path was the one that led home. "So am I," she whispered. "So am I." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in hues of gold and amber, Grace O'Malley looked at her husband and daughter and knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged, not in Boston or Tucson, but here in Rattlesnake Springs, with the family and community that had claimed her heart. The difference in their ages, once so concerning, had indeed proven to be what Tucker had predicted, merely a detail in the greater story of their lives together. What mattered was the love they shared, the family they were building, and the future that stretched before them, bright with promise and possibility.